Hi, I'm Steve Morgan, and here's a question for you. Why would I want to be talking about risk assessment, and specifically suicide risk assessment, in a lovely place like New Orleans? Well, I suppose the simplest answer to that is it happens anywhere. It could happen everywhere. But most importantly, I was quite struck by a recent article, just checking out, in the Scientific American on March the 28th, 2017, written by two consultant psychiatrists, Declan Murray and Patrick Devitt, and it's entitled Suicide Risk Assessment Doesn't Work. And it's that particular striking title that got my attention. Essentially what they try to do is set out a case example of a Friday afternoon, a distraught husband with a wife who's suicidal. And because we're talking 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, the usual approach of a practitioner would be to look at clinical factors, look at other multiple risk factors that might be involved, to make some kind of judgment of the level of suicide risk that's possible. Now, we can't get this entirely correct, and that's what the article goes on to describe in a bit more detail. And the result of that is, quite understandably, that a decision is often made on more of a risk-averse approach. Let's admit that particular lady so that we can believe that there's more chance she'd still be alive on Monday morning. Well, in this article, they set out a report of 2 meta-analyses of suicide risk research over the last 40 years. The first paper, these have been conducted in Australia. The first paper, and they were led by Matthew Large, by the way, looked at the last 40 years of suicide risk assessment research. And what they found was, when we're trying to focus with all these clinical factors and multiple risk factors, that we're trying to predict who's the highest risk of suicide, what they actually found was that 95% of high-risk patients will not die by suicide at all, and that 50% of patient suicides came from the lower risk categories. They also found in this meta-analysis that trying to predict based on multiple factors didn't seem to have any significant improvement on whether they used one particular single factor in terms of the outcomes of that suicide risk assessment. So in conclusion, from that one paper, they found that there's no statistical method to identify patients at high risk of suicide in a way that would help to improve our approach to treatment. So those that are slaves to the numbers, there is no statistical evidence that really provides a massive improvement. The second paper is a meta-analysis of suicide risk factors and risk assessment scales in people that have previously harmed themselves. And in this they looked at the 4 strongest factors that emerge from suicide risk assessment. When we're particularly talking about things like previous episodes of self-harm, suicidal intent, physical health problems, and the male gender. And what they found that these were so common in their incidence that they really don't do anything to actually help in terms of us making those predictive decisions about suicide intent. There's also another important message that comes from this second paper. There was no evidence to support the use of risk assessment scales. The researchers believe that the widespread use of suicide risk assessment diverts clinicians from real engagement with patients. They go on to say that we may well be putting our own professional anxieties above the needs of service users. And the researchers conclude, paradoxically, increasing the risks of suicide following self-harm. There's the big statement. Paradoxically, increasing the risks of suicide following self-harm, by our focus on self-preservation, using risk assessment scales for our own purposes. In truth, the results are not entirely surprising, and certainly a number of the guidelines that have been produced in recent years will go on to say that we shouldn't rely particularly on scales that give rough judgments on high risk, low risk, medium risk. So is it all negative? Well, the paper goes on to give some positive follow-ups, and the main message is that the best way of assessing and working with this suicide risk is to engage with people. They're experiencing emotional pain, and our focus, whilst we can use to a limited extent the suicide risk assessment scales to give us some clues, some indicators, the most important thing is that we engage with a person to find the sources for them of their emotional pain, and that we work to offer a range of treatments, whether that's medical treatments, social treatments, interventions and support, helping them with their own learning and coping skills to try and understand that emotional pain and resolve that in collaboration with us. And that is the approach, the clinical approach, that will provide the best clinical outcomes for the people themselves, and good practice, best practice, is the best form of defence for us as clinicians as well. So the reality is that 99.9% of people very suicidal on a Friday afternoon will still be alive on Monday morning, almost despite what we do. But we can certainly focus our attentions, like crisis management teams, home treatment teams do, focus very much on that clinical relationship, that engaged relationship, and helping people to understand their experiences and develop some of their own coping mechanisms. And therein lies a connection with positive risk taking, because we are analysing information, making decisions based on very thoughtful, collaborative approaches. And so I end by saying, take some risks, but only when you're clear about the positive outcomes.